You'll all join me in welcoming Senator John McCain.
You know, Bob, every place I go, everybody comes up and says, I voted for you, I voted for you. I think I should demand a recount. So thank you all for your kind welcome.
Well, thank you very much for joining us today. I know it's a busy time for Congress, and you've got all kinds of hearings, but there's also an awful lot going on in the world, and so we're grateful for the opportunity to talk to you about them. And the subject for the conference today, as you know, is Afghanistan, and we're all talking about the recent plan set forth by President Barack Obama. You missed the first two panels because you were at a hearing. I just want you to know that it's been a love fest. It's been a bipartisan love fest the whole time that we've been here. People are mumbling about we should get a room. I just want you to, you know, if you want to break that up, you're welcome to. But I guess I think a question that probably a lot of people would want to know is, there was a lot of talk about Afghanistan during the campaign. You put forth a plan, Senator Obama put forth a plan. I wonder if you were in his shoes right now, how different would your plan look from what he has set forth?
Well, thank you, Bob, and could I congratulate the Foreign Policy Initiative on their great beginning. I know you had great panels. I've already been briefed this morning. This is obviously the now front and center national security issue that confronts our country in a world full of great challenges. And I mentioned that I was in Brussels at a conference over the weekend, and Bob Kagan did a particularly spectacular job in a panel of, let's say, shall I say, divergent views, and he really did a good job. I support the plan. I think that our panel members of both sides of the aisle earlier today reflected that. I probably would have done a few things differently. One, and most importantly, I think, is to emphasize, and the President did, but I think you've really got to emphasize how difficult this challenge is, and that as with the surge, there will be an increase in conflict, therefore an increase in casualties as we move south in Afghanistan and try to reassert control in some regions of Afghanistan, including the challenges on the border. So we will and can and must succeed, but it's not going to be easy. And there may not be an Anbar awakening. I think part of the overall strategy is to attract Taliban and other extremists to our side, but there may not be the dramatic reversal we saw in Iraq. And by the way, it's not as tough as Iraq, my friends, and don't let anybody tell you that it is. Because when we started the surge, Iraq was virtually in a state of collapse. Casualties, you look at the casualty rates, you look at all the parameters that judge how you're doing in a conflict. Iraq was tougher than this issue is, although it has its own set of challenges. The second thing I would have done probably is went ahead and announced the overall additional 10,000 troops, rather than be accused of a Lyndon Johnson-style incrementalism, because it's very clear what General McKiernan asked for, even though they may not be right away. And I would have probably gone ahead and announced that we intend to do that. And I guess, third of all, I think that it's very important that we continue to consult with Congress and with the leaders on both sides of the aisle to prevent a sort of a resurgence of anti-war activity as this situation worsens. I would have announced a dramatic increase in the Afghan army. I'm talking about up to 250,000 person army. It's a big country, it's a big population, and we need to dramatically increase the size of the Afghan army. And those are just some of the of the areas that perhaps I would have emphasized or done differently. Overall, I appreciate the President's strategy. I appreciate the fact that there's many of our military leaders who are included in the formulation of this strategy, and I am confident that it can and will work.
I think probably if, I don't want to speak for the Obama administration, although I usually do, I think that they probably would say, look, we're in a deep, deep economic crisis. There's a slight, at very least, a slight war weariness in the country. This thing, he made a pretty strong statement, but of course, he didn't, try to bite off more than maybe the American public or Congress is willing to chew. I think that might be their argument. I guess, which leads to the question, how deep is the support in Congress in both, maybe you could do an analysis of both parties. There's been a little bit of a debate today as to whether there might be a kind of weakening of support if casualties are going to go up, inevitably, if the economic crisis doesn't sort of resolve itself in some way. How thin or deep would you say the support is on both sides of the aisle?
I think that it's problematic as to what transpires. I think a year from now, we are looking at a tougher fight than we are today. And it's hard for me to gauge, but I do believe that there is a better understanding of the reasons why we are in Afghanistan. We have not forgotten 9/11. We've not forgotten the terrible abuses that the Taliban inflicted, and we are, I think, aware more of what's at stake here than perhaps we were in Iraq. So, and General Petraeus and our military leaders probably have been enhanced in their prestige on the part of the American people and members of Congress because of the success of the strategy in Iraq. But it's hard to know. But I don't think there's any doubt that a year from now we will be looking at a greater level of opposition to the war than we are seeing today.
I mean, there's some concern, some Republicans will say, look, this is Obama's war now, he did this increase, we wash our hands of it. It wouldn't be the first time a political party had done something like that.
I think that's possible, but I don't think it's very likely, honestly, because I think the Republicans are very well aware, particularly the people like Dick Lugar and many others that are highly respected in the Republican Party are supportive. I think it's more problematic with the Democratic leadership. We all know the Speaker comes from a very liberal district. We know that Harry Reid has been very nervous about troop levels in Iraq as well as this strategy for Afghanistan. But I guess what I worry most about is Americans have not been sufficiently alerted to the difficulties that we're going to face here.
Do you have a certain amount of sympathy for the president? Do you agree with his assessment and many assessments that the Bush administration had seriously under-resourced the effort in Afghanistan?
I think that the Bush administration had under-resourced for good and bad reasons. Good reason is because we simply were short of sufficient troops to do both Iraq and Afghanistan, which argues, by the way, for a permanent and large increase in the Army and Marine Corps. This world is a long way from peaceful, and 5 years from now or 2 or 3 years from now we may be looking at very different challenges, maybe in different parts of the world. I pray not, but I think we have to be prepared for that. I think that we made mistakes in the command structure. I think we made mistakes in not perhaps being more scrutiny of the Karzai government and some of the corruption that exists. I think we didn't put enough emphasis on expanding the Afghan army. And So I think that some responsibility can be borne by the Bush administration.
The President, as you know, in his statement, I think he must have repeated about 5 times that, that the reason we hadn't done the right thing in Afghanistan was directly because of Iraq. You seem to be in some agreement with that.
I'm in some agreement, but I also think that we probably could have, or have a reason to be disappointed in the lack of participation, good participation on the part of our allies. We probably should have streamlined the command structure. We were disappointed by some of the commitments made for training police and judiciary that did not happen. And so I think that the Bush administration bears some responsibility, but I think it's also time for us to look forward. I would also argue that if we had retreated in defeat from Iraq, the challenge in Afghanistan would be immensely magnified. It was vital that we succeed in Iraq. Once we are in there, we can argue whether we should have gone in. I'll be glad to have that debate and discussion. But if we'd failed and had withdrawn, as a large number of, quote, experts said that they want us to do, the challenge in Afghanistan would have been vastly magnified.
You raised the issue of our allies, and you were just in Brussels listening to some of our allies talk about these issues. Obviously, Secretary of State Hillary Clinton is now in The Hague talking to allies about the contribution. What do you expect from our allies, and do you think they're going to meet your expectations in terms of assisting in Afghanistan?
I think it's important that President Obama has an enormous reservoir of goodwill in Europe. I think you'll see that manifested by the people's enthusiasm for his first visit as President of the United States. I think he can translate that goodwill into larger commitments on the part of our allies. I got to be very honest with you, though. I think that additional troops provided by our allies is not very likely, is certainly not in any significant number. When we were in Brussels, I met with a Canadian defense minister. 4 Canadian soldiers had been gravely wounded that day. That has a tremendous effect on public opinion in a small country. And Canada is a small country, and we're very grateful for what they've done. But I think that rather than perhaps asking for things that we're not going to get, like troop increases, we ought to ask for those things, including the reserve fund to train and equip a dramatically increased Afghan army, including training of police and the judiciary. We all know that police are corrupt in Afghanistan. Everybody knows that. And it's an integral part of any successful strategy to have a police that's effective and respected. So I think there's a lot of areas where they can and will be of assistance to us. And I think the President will probably succeed perhaps beyond some of our expectations. At least I hope so.
Do you worry that there could be, as some people have raised today, including myself, that there could be a backlash brewing in the United States if it's perceived that as America ramps up its military commitment to Afghanistan, the ratio of American to European forces really rises fairly dramatically? Will there be some resentment in the United States that America's carrying too heavy a load compared to its allies?
Throughout the Cold War, all the way back as far as I can remember, there have been complaints about the United States having to bear the majority of the burden. That's unfortunately, and in some ways fortunately, the obligations that go with being the world superpower. And I regret that we don't get more help from our allies. I regretted it during the entire Cold War. And I've regretted it, but those are realities associated with the participation or lack of by our allies. Our allies have intentionally reduced their defense spending to a level that makes them far more focused on diplomacy than on the use of military force. That's just a reality that we have to deal with. At the same time, I'm very grateful for the British. I'm very grateful for the Canadians. I'm very grateful for many of our allies who have made significant contribution, and maybe we're not grateful enough from time to time as we should be.
You also mentioned about...
And let me mention one other thing,
sorry.
if I could, real quick. If our allies and nations in the region know that we are there until we succeed, then I think that has an impact on their willingness or lack of willingness to participate as well. This business always, we got to have an exit strategy. We got to have an exit strategy. We got to have a date certain. My friends, the date certain comes sooner when we have convinced both our enemies and our friends that we will succeed, that we will not allow Afghanistan to evolve into a base for terrorist attacks on the United States of America and a place of chaos and disintegration. That's the quickest way to victory.
You raised the question of the problem of insufficient just overall military capability during the Bush years when we were engaged in both Iraq and Afghanistan. What about now? It seems to me the pressure in Congress on both sides of the aisle is to reduce the defense budget, and so I don't understand how we can square that with an increased commitment in Afghanistan and a continuing commitment in Iraq.
I think it's very tough to square the present budget proposal with the size of the military, our commitment in Afghanistan, and our gradual withdrawal from Iraq. I think it's an unrealistic assessment, particularly, again, looking at the situation in the world. I do not predict any kind of conflict with China, but it should disturb us a bit when a U.S. Navy ship in international waters is surrounded by Chinese, I don't know what you want to call them, vessels. And so there's tensions that can only be addressed, I think, both through good diplomacy and furthering good relations, but also a military capability that is one which serves as a deterrence to adventurism and misbehavior in any part of the world.
I mean, there's always, as you're suggesting, there's always a trade-off between current capabilities to deal with the conflicts that we're currently in and facing potential problems that are maybe 10, 20 years down the road. I think that under Rumsfeld, there was a great prejudice in favor of worrying about the 20 years down the road and perhaps under-resourcing the immediate conflicts. I wonder whether we're now in the midst of a shift toward focusing on the immediate conflicts and maybe killing, and I think this is an issue that you've talked about, killing some weapons programs that really are looking forward to conflicts that we haven't even thought about having yet.
Could I mention also that we look back and we want to place blame and responsibility, and a certain amount of that is appropriate so that we don't repeat the mistakes. But I would argue that we, to some degree, squandered the, quote, peace dividend during the 1990s after the fall of the Berlin Wall and our expectation that we were at the end of history. And back to the budget for 1 second here. I don't see how you could have a reduction and still acquire some of the weapon systems we need to. Classic example of our forward thinking and yet mistakes at the same time is the futures combat systems. The Army's proposal, which is now up, I believe, to $130 billion, and we still haven't got the first operational aspect of it, which was going to provide us with our equipment for future conflicts, and actually it's stalled out. You could make that same argument about other weapon systems, including the Joint Strike Fighter. So we're going to have to regain some of the balance between affordable and doable weapon systems, but at the same time not have the kinds of cost overruns. Defense procurement reform, which I share priority with the President, is an absolute requirement. Finally, could I just give you a practical example? I was talking about it with General Petraeus yesterday. The first and second battles of Fallujah were not very much different than the battle for Hue. We had Marines go in, an Army go in, house-to-house fighting, people shooting from the rooftops, having to blow up houses, etc., and we paid a very heavy price in both the first and second battles of Fallujah. Look at the Battle of Sadr City. Get a briefing on the Battle of Sadr City. We were able to use technology to an incredible degree to, as General Petraeus put it, make our enemies take a knee, because we punished them every time their heads popped up. Every time they tried to fire a rocket, every time they tried to assassinate somebody, our surveillance and intelligence capabilities, ranging from the most rudimentary, where people were informing on a person-to-person basis, to the best kind of high technology, which would track them wherever they went and hunt them down. So there is a great virtue in technology advances in warfare, but you got to match the technology to the challenge rather than just the technology for the technology's sake. I know that that's a bit of a complicated answer, but that's the challenge of combating future enemies, is having technology match the threat rather than technology for technology's sake.
Let's move from Afghanistan to Pakistan, which is, the whole thing is now called AFPAC, I'm told. And the premise of AFPAC is that there's no solving Afghanistan without solving Pakistan, or there's no solving Pakistan without solving Afghanistan, or one of those. But what is your view of Pakistan? That did also come up during the campaign. Now we've got a situation where people think that things are getting worse in Pakistan. We've got expanding drone attacks. What's your thoughts about Pakistan and the way, well, not only the way the administration is handling it, but the way anybody would have to handle it?
I think the attack on the police academy yesterday was an indicator that the extremists have a significant capability. The attack in Mumbai was an incredibly sophisticated operation, and it didn't get more attention in the United States because it didn't happen in the United States. But when you look at that attack and the way they orchestrated, 10 people were able to virtually paralyze that city for about, I think, 24 or 36 hours, I've forgotten. And this attack yesterday on the police academy is another example of people, they're willing to die, but not as suicide bombers. They want to take a whole lot of people with them before they go. That is a shift in tactics and strategy on the part of terrorists, and one that we're going to have to learn to cope with. I believe that Pakistan by itself is a vital national security interest in the United States of America. They're a nuclear-armed country. They have a very large population, their geographic situation. All of it argues for a Pakistan strategy for Pakistan alone. Now, is Pakistan important and very important as far as our ability to succeed in Afghanistan? Yes, but this notion that you cannot succeed in Afghanistan without a success in Pakistan to a large degree, I don't subscribe to. We were able to succeed in Iraq with Iranians sending in the most lethal IEDs, the Syrians being a transshipment point for suicide bombers, and we never had to fight the Iranians, and we obviously, by our success, is exactly what reduced the activities from both Iran and, to a large degree, eliminated to some degree from Syria. So we can succeed. It'll be a lot harder and a lot tougher, but we need a strategy that involves both countries, but we also need a separate strategy as regards to Pakistan by itself. And I don't have to tell anybody in this room the political turmoil and the problems with the ISI and all of those, but the fact is that Pakistan still does have an elected government and a stumbling but functioning democracy, and I don't see signs that the military wants to take over Pakistan again for good reasons and practical reasons.
What about the idea of conditioning aid to the military and to Pakistan on the basis of their performance?
I'm always nervous about that, because if you point a gun at somebody, you better be prepared to pull the trigger. I think Kayani is a good leader. I worry, and we all continue to worry about the penetration of the ISI and the interlocking relationship between the military and the ISI as well. But I think we ought to do everything we can to further democracy. I think encourage stability, encourage cooperation. I would like for us to go up, not cross the line between persuasion and threats of withdrawing our assistance and our involvement with Pakistan, because I don't think we could do that. At the same time, a careful balance of persuasion and showing the Pakistan government and people that it is in their interest for us to succeed in Afghanistan and in the border areas and now in other parts of Pakistan as well. And I think we can do that because every election that's held in Pakistan, extremists are rejected that are on the ballot. It's not that they have this large base of popular support. They don't, even in the areas where the Taliban and other extremist organizations have control. So it's not as if we are facing a Pakistani public opinion that is anything but in pursuit of the same goals that we share.
There are those who've made the argument that the drone attacks themselves undermine Pakistani support for American objectives. What's your view on that?
My view is that it's probably, and I'm glad I'm not part of the administration, it's probably a wise thing to do, particularly when we can specifically identify these people. And it is part of an overall strategy, but it's only a part. I'd remind you, when we had 120,000 troops in Iraq, and every night, and even every day, we were going out and we were killing off bad people and their leadership. And everybody would say, boy, that's great. We killed off the local Al-Qaeda or whichever group it was, leadership, JAM, whoever it was. And yet we were losing. We were losing even though we were able to, through intelligence and our drones, etc., kill off some of these people. So it can't be the only strategy is what I'm saying. I think it should probably be done. But don't think it's the strategy that will achieve success.
All right, I'll just ask one final question, then open it up to the audience.
Good.
We're now engaged in a lot of discussions with a lot of regional players. We have a regional approach. If you go around the periphery of Afghanistan and look at some of the major powers there, it's sort of who wants to be helpful and who doesn't want to be helpful. If you look at Russia, Iran, Pakistan, and some of the others, do you think that they all want to try, India, do they all want to try to be helpful in Afghanistan?
I think some of them are very ambivalent. And let's talk about Iran, for example. I don't think the Iranians want the Taliban to take over Afghanistan. At the same time, they obviously take great pleasure in seeing us in difficulties there. So I think they're kind of ambivalent about it, very unlike their approach to Iraq. The Russians, again, there's a bit of pragmatism there with the Russians, but they have had their problems with Islamic extremists, and they certainly wouldn't, I don't think, like to see a Taliban-dominated government. I think they, in the case of Pakistan, their economic difficulties, which are deep and severe right now, are exacerbating all of their problems. And that's why I support this aid and assistance and economic aid and assistance to Pakistan right now. And with the precondition that much of that money will be wasted. I'm sorry. And we'll do everything we can to have it accounted for and everything, but there will be stories on the front page of newspapers about some of the corruption and some of the problems that are associated with it. So India is very interesting in my view because there is a view in Pakistan that the Indians are taking control of the economy and forging close alliances with Afghanistan. I don't think that's true. But there is that belief, and part of it is based on this deep-seated animosity that exists between Afghanistan and Pakistan, which reminds me that still, if you ask the majority of the Pakistani people and military, they'd probably say that the greater threat to their security is still India as opposed to Afghanistan, which then makes understandable some of their lack of movement of troops, lack of efforts, significant efforts to reassert control in certain parts of the border areas. So the relations with Afghan's neighbors are complex, but I think that if we begin to succeed in Afghanistan and restore control, and then all of the things that follow that, then I think their neighbors will behave in a more responsible fashion.
Thank you. I probably have hogged up too much time. We have time for 1 or 2 questions, and 2 if the first one is brief. Yes, sir. Nope. Yep, you. Oh, right. Looking for a... There you go.
Thank you. I have a question about Afghanistan's government. How should we encourage the Karzai administration or another successor, if he's booted out in August, to be more effective, to be less corrupt, and to generally improve their country? What are your thoughts?
I think we all know that right now, anyway, there is not a viable opponent or a strong opponent to President Karzai. Now, one may emerge. There is certainly great dissatisfaction in parts of Afghanistan towards the government, and we all know about the corruption situation. So I don't envision a scenario right now where President Karzai would be defeated. A lot of things happen in politics, but if he were, then I think we would obviously try to forge a new and productive relationship. I'd like to remind you that, again, going back to one of my formative experiences, if you look at Vietnam, the assassination of Diem was a seminal moment. And it meant really a lack of support for the government, a lack of an effective government. We had revolving door of generals running Saigon. So we want to be careful about how we approach the Karzai situation, and certainly not, in my view, interfere in what is really a domestic election in Afghanistan.
Yes, sir.
Senator, do you believe that the heart and the brains of our adversaries are in Pakistan, not in Afghanistan?
I think the heart and brains of our adversary are literally all over the world. I think that they are Islamic extremists that have a goal of imposing their will and their brand of the Quran on, which is not in keeping with, obviously, the majority of people of Muslim faith, obviously, and that they view Afghanistan as a place where they could further those aims and goals. Their goals are not just confined to Afghanistan. They are confined to taking on who they view as the enemy, and that is the people and governments and countries of the rest of the world. But I believe a lot of the talent probably is residing in parts of Pakistan right now.
Thank you, Senator. Once again, you've shown that you're a pillar of wisdom and clarity in a world that needs a lot of that, and we're very grateful for the time that you've spent with us today. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
And that's the end of our conference, and I just want to thank you all for coming and spending this much time with us, and I hope you found it a useful and productive session. We certainly enjoyed it. Thanks a lot. Hi.